This is offline, connected overnight. Tonight's reading, Eudaimonia, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and Sartre's Being and Nothingness. 90 minutes. Put this on while you sleep, while you drive, or while you wind down. Let your attention come and go. The Nicomachean Ethics opens with a single claim that has structured Western moral philosophy for more than 23 centuries. Every art, every inquiry, every action and pursuit aims at some good. Aristotle wrote this in Athens, around 350 before Common Era, in a text that his ancient editors compiled from lecture notes and possibly student transcriptions. The treatise is named for Nicomachus. Whether Nicomachus was Aristotle's son who edited the work or merely its dedicatee is a question that classical scholars have not definitively settled. The text itself, 10 books organized as a single extended argument, represents Aristotle's most sustained attempt to answer what he took to be the central question of practical philosophy. How should a human being live? The question sounds simple. Aristotle's answer is not. He begins by establishing a hierarchy of goods. Medicine aims at health. Shipbuilding aims at a vessel. Strategy aims at victory. But these are not terminal goods. They are instrumental goods valued because of what they produce. Aristotle argues that if all action aims at some good, and if goods are nested in this way, there must be some good that is not nested, some end valued for its own sake, and not for anything further. This he calls the highest good to Aristotle, and he identifies it with Eudaimonia. The term Eudaimonia is typically rendered in English as happiness, but this translation is contested. The classical scholar Julia Annas, in her 1993 study, The Morality of Happiness, argues that flourishing more accurately captures Aristotle's meaning, because eudaimonia in the Nicomachean Ethics is not a subjective feeling state, but an objective condition of living and doing well. The Greek prefix eu means well, and daimon in this context refers not to a demonic entity, but to one's guiding spirit or lot. So eudaimonia is something closer to having a good daimon, which classical usage translated into prospering or faring well. Aristotle's procedure for establishing what eudaimonia consists in is methodologically distinctive. He does not begin from first principles and deduce. He begins from endoxa, common beliefs, the established opinions of most people and of the wise, and works from them through critical examination. This method, set out in the topics and practiced throughout the ethical works, begins with what is accepted and refines it through philosophical scrutiny rather than discarding it for a theory constructed from scratch. In Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle surveys the candidates for the highest good. Most people, he observes, identify it with pleasure. This was the view associated with the Cyrenaics, particularly Aristippus of Cyrene, who in the early 4th century BCE developed a hedonist ethics in which bodily pleasure constituted the supreme good. Aristotle allows that pleasure is a genuine good, but argues it cannot be the highest good because orienting one's life entirely toward pleasure is the life of cattle. Not because pleasure is base, but because a life so oriented fails to deploy the capacities that are distinctive to human beings. A second candidate is honor. The political life aims at honor, time in Greek, and Aristotle acknowledges that those who lead active civic lives are pursuing something significant. but he objects that honor depends on those who bestow it. Honor lies in the giver, not in the one who receives it. A person genuinely deserving of honor can be dishonored by a tyrant or an ignorant assembly. If the highest good can be taken away by the judgment of others, it is not sufficiently stable to serve as the terminus of the entire human striving. The third candidate is wealth cremata. Aristotle dismisses this almost immediately. Wealth is useful only insofar as it purchases other things. It is purely instrumental. No one values money for its own sake in a terminal sense. They value what money can produce. Then comes the significant philosophical detour, Plato's form of the good. Aristotle's teacher Plato, in a Republic composed around 380 before Common Era, had argued that the good itself was a single transcendent form in which all good things participated, accessible only through the long philosophical education described in books 6 and 7 of that dialogue. Aristotle, who had joined Plato's academy in Athens around 367 before Common Era and remained there until Plato's death in 347 before Common Era, breaks with this view explicitly in Book 1, Chapter 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. The argument is precise. If the good is a single form, then good should have only one meaning. But in fact, good is predicated across the Aristotelian categories: substance, quality, quantity, time, place, relation. And these categories have no single common term running through them. There is no single science of the good in Plato's sense because goods are too heterogeneous to constitute a single subject of inquiry. This critique was not casual. Aristotle identifies himself as arguing against his friends, noting explicitly that it is a duty to prefer truth even over those one loves. The friends in question are the Platonists. Having set aside Plato's form, Aristotle turns to constructing his own account. The ergon argument, the function argument, appears in Book 1, Chapter 7, and is the pivot on which the entire Nicomachean Ethics turns. The argument proceeds as follows. Every craft and profession has a characteristic function, ergon in Greek. The ergon of a flautist is to play the flute. The ergon of a sculptor is to produce statues. In each case, what constitutes doing well is performing that function well. Is there then a characteristic function of a human being as such? Aristotle argues that there is. It is the active exercise of the soul's faculties in accordance with virtue, or, if there are several virtues, in accordance with the best and most complete. The word active exercise, energia in Greek, is doing significant philosophical work here. Eudaimonia is not a state one is in, but an activity one performs. Not something one has, but something one does. T.H. Irwin, in his 1985 translation and commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics published by Hackett, emphasizes that energia, for Aristotle, is the active exercise of a capacity, not the latent possession of it. A person asleep or unconscious possesses capacities, but is not exercising them. Their eudaimonia, on the ergon argument, is an abeyance, which is precisely why Aristotle will add that eudaimonia must be achieved in a complete life, not merely in a single excellent moment. Aristotle adds qualifications. First, the activity must be in accordance with virtue, arete. But which virtue? If there are multiple virtues, the activity must be in accordance with the best and most complete. This points toward the later books of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle distinguishes virtues of character from virtues of intellect, and ultimately privileges the contemplative intellectual life. Second, the activity must be pursued in a complete life, in biotelio. Aristotle invokes the observation attributed to the Athenian statesman Solon, who lived approximately 638 to 558 before Common Era, that one should call no person fortunate until they are dead, because prosperity can reverse. This raises what the moral philosopher Martha Nussbaum, in her 1986 study, The Fragility of Goodness, calls the problem of moral luck. If eudaimonia requires external conditions, health, friends, material sufficiency, political stability, then it is fragile in a way that seems to undermine its status as the unconditional highest good. Aristotle does not resolve this tension fully in Book 1. He acknowledges it. Eudaimonia does require some external goods. A person who is severely ill, without friends, utterly isolated, or crushed by material deprivation is unlikely to achieve it. But he insists that the primary component is virtuous activity, and that external goods are supportive rather than constitutive. The Stoics will later reject this position entirely. A disagreement that runs through Cicero's philosophical dialogues and becomes one of the structuring controversies of ancient ethical theory for the following 5 centuries. Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics closes with a preliminary definition. Eudaimonia is the active exercise of the soul's faculties in accordance with virtue in a complete life with a sufficient complement of external goods. It then provides the typology of the soul, irrational faculties including the nutritive and appetitive, and the rational faculty divided into the part that reasons strictly and the part capable of being guided by reason. That provides the architecture for the remainder of the treatise. What follows in books 2 through 10 is the working out of what virtuous activity means across every domain of human life. The second book of the Nicomachean Ethics opens with a distinction that reappears in every subsequent virtue ethics tradition: the difference between intellectual virtues and virtues of character. Intellectual virtues arise and grow primarily from teaching. They require experience and time to develop. Virtues of character arise from habituation. The very word for character in Greek, ethos, is a slight modification of the word for habit, ethos, a proximity Aristotle notes explicitly. This is not merely etymological observation. Aristotle is making a substantive claim about how moral development works. One becomes courageous by doing courageous acts. One becomes just by performing just actions. One becomes temperate by exercising temperance. We do not first develop the virtue in some interior space and then act from it. We develop the virtue through acting. This stands in sharp contrast to the Socratic position, attributed to Socrates 469 to 399 before Common Era. Through Plato's Meno and other early dialogues, that virtue is a form of knowledge, that if you genuinely know what is good, you will necessarily do it. Aristotle's treatment of akrasia in Book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics directly refutes this. Akrasia, weakness of will, or incontinence in older translations, is precisely the condition of knowing what one should do and failing to do it. The person who knows that excessive drinking damages health, but drinks anyway exhibits akrasia. The phenomenon proves, for Aristotle, that moral virtue cannot be reduced to intellectual knowledge, because knowledge can be present while action runs contrary to it. The doctrine of the mean, mesos in Greek, appears in Book 2 and is the formal structure of Aristotle's virtue theory. Each virtue of character is a disposition to feel and act appropriately, where appropriately means hitting the mean between two opposed vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Courage, Andrea, is the mean between cowardice, deilia, and rashness, Thersites. Temperance, Sophrosyne, is the mean between licentiousness and insensibility. Generosity, Eleutherios, is the mean between wastefulness and miserliness. Good temper, Praeotes, is the mean between irascibility and a kind of emotional flattening that Aristotle notes is so rarely exhibited it has no common Greek name. The list of virtues Aristotle enumerates in books 3 and 4 runs to 12 entries, including courage, temperance, generosity, magnificence, megaloperpia, the virtue of spending well on a large scale, greatness of soul, megalopsychia, often rendered as proper pride, the virtue of accurately assessing one's own worth, appropriate ambition, good temper, friendliness, truthfulness about oneself, wit, eutropelia, facility in social humor, and appropriate shame, eidos. The comprehensiveness of this catalog reflects Aristotle's empirical method. Rather than deriving virtues from first principles, he takes the full range of human social contexts and asks, for each, what the disposition to feel and act well in that context would look like. The mean is not, however, an arithmetic mean. It is not split the difference moderation. Aristotle is explicit that the virtuous mean is the mean relative to us, to pros hamas meson, the appropriate amount given the circumstances, the relationships, the stakes, and the specific person. He uses the example of a trainer who prescribes diet. Milo of Croton, the 6th century BCE wrestler who reportedly won 6 Olympic crowns and whose physical strength was legendary throughout Greece and beyond, required a different quantity of food than a beginning athlete. What is appropriate is indexed to the individual situation, and determining what is appropriate in any given situation requires judgment. This is the point at which phronesis enters the analysis. Phronesis, practical wisdom, is the subject of Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and it is there that Aristotle introduces what many commentators have called the master virtue of the entire work. Phronesis is not a virtue of character, but an intellectual virtue, specifically the intellectual virtue concerned with action. The person who possesses phronesis, the phronimos, is the one who can deliberate well about what conduces to eudaimonia, not about particular technical ends that belongs to craft knowledge, technique, but about living well as a whole. The phronimos perceives the morally salient features of particular situations correctly, and from this perception deliberates to a choice, prohairesis, that is integrated with desire. Aristotle draws a further claim about the unity of the virtues. One cannot have any virtue of character, properly speaking, without having phronesis, and one cannot have phronesis without having the virtues of character. Clever people, those with the capacity to reason well toward given ends, what Aristotle calls decodes, can pursue vicious ends with their reasoning capacity fully engaged. Phronesis is cleverness directed toward genuinely good ends, and genuinely good ends are only perceived correctly by someone who already has good character. The unity thesis was contested in antiquity. The Stoics accepted a version of it. They argued that the sage, the spaideos, possessed all virtues or none. Chrysippus reportedly acknowledged that the fully virtuous person was rarer than the phoenix. Books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics give extended treatment to friendship, philia, as a component of eudaimonia. Aristotle distinguishes three kinds of friendship: those based on utility, in which each party values the other for what they provide; those based on pleasure, in which each party enjoys the other's company; and those based on virtue, in which each party values the other for who they are as a person. Only the third kind, character friendship, is complete friendship, and only it contributes directly to eudaimonia. Friendships of utility and pleasure dissolve when the utility or pleasure ceases. Character friendships, because each party values the other as a whole person, are durable and mutually sustaining of virtue. Aristotle's claim that a fully flourishing human being requires character friends is one of the features that most sharply distinguishes his ethics from later Stoic ethics. For the Stoics, as we will see, the sage's eudaimonia is complete even in isolation, even under physical torture. This difference is not peripheral. It reflects a deep disagreement about the relationship between eudaimonia and the external world. Aristotle holds that some external conditions, including the social condition of having genuine friends, are partially constitutive of flourishing, not merely instrumentally useful to it. Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics contains Aristotle's most contested claim, that the best human life is the contemplative life, devoted to theoria, sustained philosophical and theoretical reflection. The contemplative life is superior because nous, the highest human faculty, when exercised in the activity of theoria, most fully actualizes what is distinctive about human nature. Aristotle goes further. The pure intellectual life of the philosopher mirrors, in some sense, the life of the unmoved mover, the divine intellect described in Metaphysics Lambda as thinking itself thinking. The classical philosopher John Cooper, in his 1975 study, Reason and Human Good in Aristotle, argued that the Theoria passages represent a tension within the Nicomachean Ethics, that books 1 through 9 build an account of eudaimonia centered on the practically virtuous political life, while Book 10 substitutes the philosophical life. T.H. Irwin's interpretation, defending what is called the inclusive end reading, holds that eudaimonia includes both the contemplative and the practically virtuous life, with theoria as the highest component, but not the sole one. Richard Kraut, in his 1989 study, Aristotle and the Human Good, defends the dominant end reading. Eudaimonia just is the contemplative life, and the other virtues are valuable as conditions that enable it. This debate remains active. What the Nicomachean Ethics leaves established, regardless of where one comes down on the theoria question, is a framework in which eudaimonia is activity rather than state, requires virtue rather than being identical with it, depends on stable character built through habituation, requires a measure of external goods, is constitutively social in including genuine character friendship, and is teleologically grounded in the structure of the human soul. This framework will be the point of departure for the Stoics, and in their most important moves, the point of systematic departure. In approximately 301 before Common Era, ancient chronology here is imprecise, and different sources give slightly different dates. A Phoenician merchant named Zeno of Citium arrived in Athens after being shipwrecked near Piraeus while transporting a cargo of purple dye from his home city of Citium in Cyprus. According to Diogenes Laertius, who compiled biographical notices of the philosophers in the early 3rd century CE in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, Zeno found himself in an Athenian bookseller's shop, read Xenophon's Memorabilia, the account of Socrates' conversations, and asked the bookseller where he might find men like Socrates. The bookseller pointed to Crates of Thebes, a cynic philosopher who happened to be passing by. Zeno became Crates' student, later studied under the Megarian philosopher Stilpo and under the Platonist Polemon, then head of Plato's Academy. Synthesizing these influences, around 300 before Common Era, Zeno began teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a public colonnade on the north side of the Athenian agora that gave the school its name. Zeno's central ethical innovation was to sever the Aristotelian connection between eudaimonia and external goods. Aristotle had held that some external goods, health, friends, adequate material resources, civic standing, were necessary conditions for eudaimonia, even if virtuous activity was the primary condition. Zeno argued that virtue alone, eudaimon, is sufficient for eudaimonia. External goods are proegmena adiaphora, preferred indifference. One has rational reason to prefer health over sickness, wealth over poverty, life over death, but these preferences do not determine the quality of one's life in the fundamental sense. Only virtue, living in accordance with reason, which for the Stoics is identical with living in accordance with nature, kata fusin, constitutes the highest good. This move was radical and was immediately recognized as such. The Peripatetics, members of Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, and the Stoics spent the subsequent 3 centuries in sustained philosophical debate over whether external goods were genuinely indifferent or merely secondary goods. Cicero, the Roman statesman and philosopher born in 106 before Common Era and assassinated on December 7th, 43 before Common Era by agents of the Second Triumvirate, documented this debate with remarkable clarity in his De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on the ends of good and evil, written in 45 before Common Era. In books 3 and 4, Cicero has the younger Cato articulate the Stoic position systematically, and then subjects it to critique from the academic and peripatetic perspectives. The central question, whether the things Aristotle called external goods genuinely contribute to the highest good or are truly indifferent, is one of the most precisely argued philosophical exchanges in ancient literature. Zeno's immediate successor as head of the Stoic school was Cleanthes of Assos, who lived approximately 330 to 230 before Common Era and held the position for nearly 30 years. The school's systematic theorist was Chrysippus of Soli, who lived approximately 280 to 207 before Common Era and reportedly wrote over 700 books, almost none of which survive as independent works. We know Chrysippus primarily through later summaries and critiques. In Diogenes Laertius, in Cicero, in Plutarch's polemical essay on Stoic self-contradictions written around 70 Common Era, and in fragments compiled by the 19th century classicist Hans Friedrich August von Arnim in his 4-volume collection Stoicorum Veterum Fragmenta, published from 1903 to 1924. Chrysippus gave Stoic ethics its rigorous systematic form. The concept of the hegemonican, the ruling faculty, the seat of rational judgment and the processing of impressions, the theory of passions, path, as cognitive errors, consisting in false judgments about the value of indifference, and the doctrine of appropriate action, kathekon, denoting actions that accord with reason given one's circumstances and social roles. The kathekon was the Stoic response to the practical question: if external goods are genuinely indifferent, how should the Stoic act in the world? The answer was that the sage performs appropriate actions, the actions that reason, correctly applied, recommends given one's situation and roles, without making those actions the basis of eudaimonia. The Stoic soldier fights courageously not because victory is good in the terminal sense, but because fighting courageously is the appropriate action for someone in the role of soldier. The Stoic parent nurtures children not because children's flourishing is necessary for parental eudaimonia, but because nurturing is the appropriate expression of natural affinity. That natural affinity, oikiosis, often translated as appropriation or affiliation, was one of the Stoics' most important theoretical innovations. Zeno and Chrysippus held that natural affinity begins with self-concern, the basic drive of any living creature to preserve itself, and extends through concentric circles to family, friends, fellow citizens, and ultimately all rational beings. The cosmopolitan doctrine, that all human beings are citizens of a single world city, a cosmopolis, follows from oikiosis combined with the claim that what makes human beings distinctively valuable is their capacity for reason, which is universal. Diogenes of Sinope, c. 412 to 323 before Common Era. The Cynic philosopher who reportedly called himself a citizen of the world when asked where he was from is often credited with originating cosmopolitanism, but the Stoics gave it systematic philosophical grounding through the theory of oikiosis. The figure who transmitted Stoic ethics most powerfully to Marcus Aurelius was Epictetus, born approximately 50 Common Era in Hierapolis in Phrygia, the region of present-day Western Turkey. Epictetus spent his early life as a slave in Rome in the household of Epaphroditus, a freedman who had become a powerful secretary under the Emperor Nero, reigned 54 to 68 Common Era. The ancient sources report that Epictetus was lame. His leg was damaged, though the sources disagree on whether through his master's cruelty or through accident. After Nero's death in 68 Common Era and the eventual manumission of Epictetus, he studied in Rome under the Stoic philosopher Gaius Musonius Rufus, one of the most influential Stoic teachers of the 1st century CE. Around 89 Common Era, when the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome, Epictetus settled in Nicopolis in Epirus on the western coast of Greece, where he established a school that attracted students from across the Roman world. Epictetus wrote nothing. His teachings survive through the notes of his student Arian of Nicomedia, who compiled the discourses in 4 books and the Enchiridion, literally the handbook, a compressed manual of Stoic practical philosophy, most scholars believe compiled around 108 Common Era. The Enchiridion opens with what has become the most quoted formulation of Stoic ethics in the entire tradition. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. This is not merely advice about where to direct attention. It is a metaphysical claim about where the conditions of eudaimonia actually reside. If eudaimonia depends only on what is F-hemen, literally up to us, then it cannot be destroyed by anything external. Slavery, physical pain, loss of family, political ruin, none of these touches the rational, choosing self. The Stoic sage who fully grasps this principle achieves eudaimonia even under torture, a claim the Stoics advanced repeatedly, and that their critics, including the academic skeptics, found philosophically incoherent. Cicero, for all his sympathy with Stoic ethics, found the claim that virtue is entirely sufficient for happiness in extremis deeply counterintuitive, and said so in his Tusculan Disputations of 45 before Common Era, arguing that pain, even when borne courageously, remains a genuine evil. Epictetus's discourses return repeatedly to the discipline of desire, ascesis, and the discipline of assent. The discipline of desire requires that one desire only what is genuinely in one's control, the state of one's own rational faculty, and be indifferent to everything else. The discipline of assent requires that one not assent to impressions that misrepresent external events as genuinely good or evil. When a family member dies, the Epictetean discipline requires saying, "I have returned what was lent to me." The framing is severe, but it reflects a genuine philosophical position. Grief and fear are, on the Stoic account, cognitive errors, assents to impressions that misrepresent the value of what has been lost. It was this framing that Marcus Aurelius would carry with him imperfectly and repeatedly onto the campaign trail along the Danube. Marcus Annius Verus was born on April 26, 121 Common Era, in Rome, to a senatorial family of Spanish origin. His father died when Marcus was young, and he was raised first by his paternal grandfather and came under the patronage of the Emperor Hadrian, reigned 117 to 138 Common Era, who reportedly noticed Marcus's character and took an interest in his education and advancement. Hadrian is said to have given him the nickname Verissimus, the most truthful, a detail recorded by Julius Capitolinus in the Historia Augusta, though that source's reliability is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. When Hadrian designated Antoninus Pius as his successor, he required Antoninus to adopt both Marcus and Lucius Verus, ensuring a line of succession. Marcus began his serious philosophical education around 138 Common Era during Antoninus's reign. His principal Stoic teachers were Junius Rusticus, identified in the first book of the Meditations as the teacher who gave Marcus access to a personal copy of Epictetus's discourses, Apollonius of Chalcedon, also named in Book 1, and Sextus of Chaeronea, the grandson of Plutarch. In addition to philosophical instruction, Marcus studied rhetoric under Marcus Cornelius Fronto, who served as consul in 143 Common Era and was considered the preeminent Latin rhetorician of the 2nd century. The correspondence between Marcus and Fronto survives in fragments, rediscovered on a palimpsest by the cardinal and classical scholar Angelo Mai in 1815 at the Ambrosian Library in Milan. The letters date from approximately 139 Common Era to around 166 Common Era and range from rhetorical exercises to political correspondence to personal exchange. They reveal a warm relationship in which Fronto at times gently resisted Marcus's deepening philosophical seriousness. In letters from the early 140 CE, Fronto expressed concern that Stoic philosophy was drawing Marcus away from practical eloquence, a tension between philosophy and the demands of power that would become the defining condition of Marcus's entire reign. Marcus became co-emperor with Lucius Verus in 161 Common Era upon the death of Antoninus Pius on March 7th of that year, and sole emperor upon Lucius's death from illness in early 169 Common Era. His reign coincided with persistent military crises. The Parthian War of 161 to 166 Common Era, fought in the eastern provinces, was followed almost immediately by the Antonine Plague of approximately 165 to 180 Common Era, a pandemic medical historians widely identify as smallpox, introduced into Roman-controlled territory by soldiers returning from the Parthian campaign. R.J. and M.L. Littman, in a 1973 study published in the American Journal of Philology, estimated that the Antonine Plague killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman Empire, representing approximately 7 to 10% of the total population. The plague was still active when, beginning around 167 Common Era, the Germanic tribes of the Marcomanni and the Quadi crossed the Danube in force, compelling Marcus to conduct sustained military campaigns on the northern frontier that would occupy much of the remainder of his life. It was during these Danubian campaigns, from approximately 170 Common Era onward, that Marcus composed the work now known as the Meditations. The text survives in a single medieval manuscript, the Palatinus Graecus 430, which scholars believe dates to the 10th or 11th century CE. The text shows clear signs of being a private journal. There is no systematic organization. Passages repeat themselves, and Marcus never gave the work a title. The heading Ta Eis Huten to himself was attached by later editors and is the basis for the modern title. The 12 books do not follow a clear chronological order, though Book 1, which consists of acknowledgments to the people from whom Marcus learned specific virtues, has the character of a deliberate preface, and Books 2 and 3 contain internal markers suggesting composition in the early 170 CE near the Danube. Frontier. Book 5 of the Meditations is of particular interest for the question of Eudaimonia in its Stoic articulation. It opens at 5.1 with a meditation on rising in the morning. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. The translation is from Gregory Hayes's 2002 Modern Library edition, which is attentive to the colloquial register of Marcus's Greek. The Stoic philosophical content of this passage is continuous with Aristotle's ergon argument. The function of a human being is activity in accordance with reason, and to remain in bed, avoiding this function, is analogous to a vine that fails to grow or a bee that fails to work. But Marcus has translated the philosophical claim into the first person and made it into a daily practice, the kind of practice that Pierre Hadot identified as the central mode of ancient philosophy. Hadot, The French historian of ancient philosophy who died in 2010 argued throughout his career, most systematically in his 1987 French-language collection, Exercices spirituels et philosophie antique, translated into English as Philosophy as a Way of Life, and in his 1992 study, The Inner Citadel, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, that the Meditations cannot be read as a systematic philosophical treatise. Marcus was not composing philosophy for an audience. He was practicing philosophy. The Meditations are a record of what Haddock called spiritual exercises, daily practices of attention, self-examination, and a repeated application of Stoic doctrines to the situations Marcus actually faced. The repetition of themes in the text reflects the nature of the practice. One does not arrive at Stoic equanimity once and then maintain it passively. One must return to it repeatedly, as to a discipline, whenever the ruling faculty is disturbed by external events. Book 5 at 5.8 contains one of the most quoted passages of the Meditations. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Ryan Holiday's 2014 popular work, The Obstacle is the Way, made this passage widely known beyond academic philosophy, but it is worth restoring it to its Stoic context. The passage concerns the Stoic discipline of action, hormi. The Stoic doctrine of kathekon teaches that when external obstacles prevent a particular course of action, the appropriate response is not frustration but redirection. One applies rational will to whatever action is now available in the altered situation. External events cannot impede the rational will itself. They can only redirect it. The obstacle does not destroy the goal, but defines the next step toward it. Throughout Book 5, Marcus returns to the problem of social frustration, the difficulty of maintaining Stoic equanimity when governing, judging, and working alongside people who are irrational, self-interested, or actively malicious. At 5.17, he writes, "Do not disturb yourself by thinking of the whole of your life. Let not your thoughts range over the many troublesome things which have happened in the past and will happen in the future, but ask yourself with regard to every present difficulty, what is there in this that is intolerable and beyond endurance?" This formulation, the translation is from A.S.L. Farquharson's 1944 Revised Edition, applies Epictetus's temporal discipline directly, bringing attention back to the present impression and the present response, rather than generating suffering through mental projection into the past or the future. Marcus uses the word eudaimonia sparingly throughout the Meditations, and his target is not so much the achievement of eudaimonia as the practice of the conditions that the Stoics identified with it. What he pursues throughout Book 5 and the rest of the text is autarkia, self-sufficiency, the condition of not depending on externals for the quality of one's rational and moral life. The eudaimonia the Meditations aims at is the Stoic variant, the unimpeded exercise of the rational will, regardless of what the external world provides or withholds. Marcus's Stoicism carries a peculiarity that the theoretical Stoicism of Zeno or Chrysippus could not have anticipated. He was not a philosopher attempting to practice Stoic discipline in favorable or unfavorable private circumstances. He was the ruler of the largest political entity in the Western world, conducting military campaigns he did not choose, governing provinces he could not personally visit, making executive decisions that affected tens of millions of people. Anthony Burley's 1966 biography, Marcus Aurelius, traces the relationship between the philosophical content of the Meditations and the historical record of Marcus's actual decisions, some of which, including the sporadic persecution of Christian communities under governors whom Marcus appointed, sit uneasily with the Meditations' repeated emphasis on universal reason and the brotherhood of all rational beings. Whether this represents hypocrisy, political constraint, or the failure to apply one's own principles that Epictetus had warned about in Discourses Book 2, is a question that Burley addresses with care and that has no simple resolution. The concept of eudaimonia did not travel through the centuries of late antiquity and the medieval period unchanged. The Roman philosophical vocabulary had already adapted it. Cicero favored the phrase bata vita, the happy or blessed life, while Seneca the Younger, born approximately 4 before Common Era, forced to commit suicide on April 12, 65 Common Era by agents of the Emperor Nero, wrote a treatise called De Vita Beata on the happy life. Around 58 Common Era, articulating a Stoic account that incorporated social obligation more explicitly than the earlier Greek theoretical sources. But the decisive transformation of eudaimonia came through the intersection of philosophy with Christian theology. Augustine of Hippo was born on November 13th, 354 Common Era, in Thagist in the Roman province of Numidia, in present-day Algeria. He was educated in Carthage and became a teacher of rhetoric, spending 9 years as an adherent of Manichaeism, a dualist religious movement founded by the prophet Mani in 3rd century Persia, before moving through academic skepticism toward the Neoplatonist philosophy of Plotinus, 205 to 270 Common Era, whose Enneads were composed over the period approximately 254 to 270 Common Era. Augustine read Plotinus in Porphyry's Latin translation in 386 Common Era, in the Neoplatonic framework, in which reality emanates from the One, and the soul's proper activity is the ascent back toward the One, shaped his mature theology decisively. He converted to Christianity under the influence of Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and was baptized on April 25, 387 Common Era. He served as Bishop of Hippo Regius from 395 Common Era until his death on August 28, 430 Common Era, as the Vandals besieged the city. Augustine's engagement with ancient eudaimonism was not dismissive. He had read Cicero's Hortensius, a work now lost that argued for the philosophical life as the highest life, around 373 Common Era, and the reading had turned him toward philosophical seriousness. He recognized in the ancient eudaimonist question a genuine insight. The human beings are constitutively oriented toward a highest good, and that the failure to identify that good correctly produces the restlessness and disorder that characterize ordinary human life. His own formulation in the Confessions, written approximately 397 to 401 Common Era, is one of the most quoted lines in the entire Augustinian corpus. Our heart is restless until it rests in thee. The question the eudaimonists were asking, what is the highest good toward which human desire is oriented? Augustine accepted the answer that it is God, and that complete rest in God is achievable only beyond death. he argued the Eudaimonists had systematically failed to reach. In Book 19 of the City of God, written between 413 and 426 Common Era, Augustine surveys what he describes as the 288 views of the happy life catalogued by the Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro, who lived approximately 116 to 27 before Common Era, and whose encyclopedic survey of philosophy has not survived intact. The 288 is Varro's combinatoric, beginning from a set of candidate goods and combining them with competing views about the relationship between virtue and these goods. He generated this number of possible positions. Augustine works through them and argues that all fail for the same reason. They seek beatitudo, his Latin equivalent of eudaimonia, in earthly things that are finite, mutable, and liable to destruction. For Augustine, the only adequate object of the will's desire is God, who alone is infinite, immutable, and indestructible. The consequence is that complete beatitudo is eschatological. It cannot be achieved in this life. What is available in the present life is the hope of beatitude, spes beatitudinis, together with a partial and fragile peace maintained through the just ordering of earthly society. The Stoic sage who claims autarkia and eudaimonia in this life is, on Augustine's account, exhibiting superbia, pride, the fundamental Augustinian sin of claiming for the self what belongs only to God. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274 Common Era, writing the Summa Theologica from approximately 1265 Common Era until it was left incomplete at his death in March 1274, undertook a synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology that became the dominant intellectual framework of the Catholic tradition for centuries. Aristotle's works have been largely unavailable to the Latin West until the 12th century, when translations from Arabic, produced in Toledo and other centers of translation in Muslim Spain, circulated through European universities. The recovery of the Nicomachean ethics in Latin fundamentally altered European philosophy. Aquinas follows Aristotle's ergon argument closely, accepting that there is a highest good for human beings and that it consists in the activity of the highest power directed toward the highest object. The highest power is the intellect. The highest object for Aquinas is God. The perfect activity of intellect directed toward God is the beatific vision, the direct intellectual apprehension of the divine essence, available only in the afterlife through divine grace. Aquinas distinguishes imperfect beatitude, beatitudo imperfecta, achievable in this life through virtuous activity in the Aristotelian sense, from perfect beatitude, beatitudo perfecta, achievable only in the supernatural order. The Aristotelian ethical apparatus, the virtues phronesis, the doctrine of the mean, is preserved in Aquinas' account of imperfect beatitude in the secunda pars of the Summa Theologica, but the orientation is transformed. Virtue is ordered toward salvation, and salvation is a gift of grace, not an achievement of reason alone. This Augustinian and Thomistic transformation was progressively contested from the Renaissance onward. Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494 Common Era, in the Oration on the Dignity of Man, written in 1486 and planned as a prefatory speech for a philosophical disputation that was never held, shifts the emphasis toward human self-fashioning. Pico's claim is that human beings, unlike angels and animals, have no fixed nature assigned to them by God. They are placed at the center of creation and can elevate themselves through reason and choice toward the divine, or descend toward the animal. This is not yet the radical Sartrean claim that existence precedes essence, but it shares with it the idea that the human being is the entity whose nature is determined by its own activity. Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677 Common Era, expelled from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656 and thereafter living as an independent scholar and lens grinder, completed his Ethica Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata. Ethics demonstrated in geometrical order, in approximately 1674 to 1675 Common Era, published posthumously in 1677. The Ethics constructs an account of human freedom and flourishing within a strict determinist framework. God and nature are identical, Deus sive natura, and everything that occurs follows necessarily from the nature of this single substance. Human flourishing. Spinoza does not use the term eudaimonia, but his account is structurally eudaimonist, consists in adequate knowledge of one's causes, the transformation of passive emotions, driven by external causes, into active emotions, driven by one's own nature and adequate understanding, and ultimately the intellectual love of God, a more intellectualist day. The conatus, the striving of each thing to persevere in its own being, is Spinoza's naturalistic equivalent of the Aristotelian soul's orientation toward its telos. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804 Common Era, in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, and the Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, separated duty, Pflicht, from happiness, Glückseligkeit, and grounded morality entirely in the former. Kant did not deny that happiness is a genuine good. He acknowledged that every rational being necessarily desires it. But the moral law, the categorical, imperative, is grounded not in happiness, but in the rational will's self-legislation. The highest good, das höchste Gut, in Kant requires happiness proportion to virtue, but this proportion can only be guaranteed by divine providence, a postulate of practical reason, not a certainty. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873 Common Era, in Utilitarianism, 1863, attempted a partial rehabilitation of the eudaimonist tradition by distinguishing higher from lower pleasures and arguing that those who have experienced both will prefer the higher, a claim that draws on Aristotelian insights about the hierarchy of human capacities while embedding them in a consequentialist framework Aristotle would not have recognized. By the time the 20th century opened, the concept of eudaimonia had been refracted through 2 millennia of theological synthesis, Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment moral rationalism, and utilitarian social reform. And the question of what constitutes a life well lived was about to be posed under conditions that none of these frameworks had fully anticipated. Jean-Paul Sartre was born on June 21, 1905, in Paris, to a family of mixed Protestant and Catholic background. His father, Jean-Baptiste Sartre, a naval officer, died of yellow fever in Cochinchina in 1906, when Sartre was an infant. He was raised principally by his mother Amory and by his grandfather Charles Schweitzer, in whose household the young Sartre read voraciously from an early age, as he later recounted in his autobiographical work, The Words, 1963. He entered the École Normale Supérieure in Paris in 1924, set the aggregation in philosophy in 1929, and finished first in the cohort, with Simone de Beauvoir finishing second. The two had met during preparation for the aggregation and began a relationship that would continue in various configurations until Sartre's death on April 15, 1980. In 1933, Sartre went to Berlin to study the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. 1859 to 1938, the German philosopher who had founded the phenomenological method in his logical investigations of 1900 to 1901. Phenomenology, as Husserl practiced, it was the disciplined description of consciousness and its intentional structures, the way in which consciousness is always consciousness of something, always directed toward an object. Sartre spent the academic year 1933 to 1934 in Berlin, and in 1936 published his first philosophical monograph, The Transcendence of the Ego, arguing against Husserl's later view that there is a transcendental ego, a constituting self, at the basis of consciousness. For Sartre, consciousness is not itself a thing. It is a sheer movement of intentionality, a relation to objects with nothing fixed behind it. Being and Nothingness, an essay on phenomenological ontology, was published in June 1943 during the German occupation of Paris. Sartre had been mobilized in 1939, captured in June 1940 during the fall of France, held as a prisoner of war in a camp at Trier, and released in March 1941 after feigning illness. He returned to Paris, continued teaching at the Lycée Pasteur and later the Lycée Condorcet, and completed the manuscript under occupation. The book was published by Gallimard, running to over 700 pages in the original French edition. Hazel Barnes, the American philosopher who produced the first English translation published in 1956, described the translation project as requiring more than 2 years of sustained work. Sartre's ontological framework divides all of being into two fundamental modes. Being in itself, être en soi, is the mode of things. Massive, opaque, self-identical, fully what it is. A stone is a stone. An inkwell is an inkwell. Neither has any gap between what it is and what it is. Being for itself, être pour soi, is the mode of consciousness, characterized by the annihilating capacity of nothingness. The for itself is never simply what it is. Consciousness is always at a distance from itself, always projecting toward what is not yet, always carrying a negation of the given at its heart. The for itself exists as its own lack. It is the being which is what it is not, and is not what it is, a formulation Sartre uses repeatedly and intends literally, not rhetorically. This ontological division provides the philosophical ground for bad faith, mauvaise foi, the concept that carries most of the weight of Sartre's implicit ethics. Bad faith is examined most directly in Part 1, Chapter 2 of Being and Nothingness. Sartre defines bad faith as a lie to oneself, but the formulation requires care because self-deception involves a paradox. The deceiver and the deceived are the same person, which means the person must simultaneously know and not know the truth. Ordinary lying requires two distinct parties. Self-deception appears to collapse this distinction. Sartre argues that bad faith is possible because of the non-thetic structure of consciousness. Consciousness is not fully transparent to itself. It does not always thematize or explicitly acknowledge what it implicitly registers. The Bad Faith Project exploits this non-coincidence of consciousness with itself. Sartre's analysis of the Parisian waiter, Le Garçon de Café, has become one of the most discussed passages in 20th century philosophy. The waiter performs his role with an exaggerated precision. His movements are slightly too mechanical, his posture slightly too erect, his gestures slightly too crisp. He is playing at being a waiter in the way a soldier plays at being a soldier. He is trying to be the thing waiter, to have the solidity, the givenness, the density of a thing. But this project is in bad faith, because the waiter is not a waiter the way an inkwell is an inkwell. He chose to be a waiter this morning. He chooses to continue being a waiter each moment he continues. His for itself, his consciousness, his freedom, cannot be eliminated or exhausted by identification with any social role, no matter how complete the identification appears. Bad faith is not simply hypocrisy or deception in the ordinary sense. When one lies to another person, the liar knows the truth. Bad faith is a deeper project. The attempt to transform the for itself into the in itself, to treat freedom as if it were a property one does not have, to treat one situation as if it were an essence that fully determines who one is. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976 Common Era, in Being and Time, published in 1927, had used the term inauthenticity, Uneigentlichkeit, for a structurally related condition, the falling of Dasein into Das Man, the anonymous they of everyday social existence, in which one thinks what one is supposed to think and does what one is supposed to do without owning one's existence as one's own. Sartre's mauvaise foi differs from Heideggerian inauthenticity in that Sartre grounds it in the specific ontological structure of the for itself rather than in an existential analytic of Dasein. But both concepts identify a fundamental mode of evading the claims that one's own existence makes. The opposite of bad faith is authenticity, authenticite. Sartre is deliberately reticent in Being and Nothingness about what authentic existence consists in positively. He notes that a complete account of authenticity would require a further work on ethics, a work he announced but never completed, of which partial notes were published posthumously in 1983 as notebooks for an ethics. What is clear in Being and Nothingness is a structure of authentic existence. It involves acknowledging one's freedom without denial, acknowledging one's facticity, one's body, one's past, one's social position, the given aspects of one's situation that were not chosen, without pretending that facticity is destiny, and holding these two aspects of existence in a tension that is neither collapsed into full identification with one's role nor escaped into fantasies of unconditioned freedom. Sartre's formulation of existence preceding essence was presented most accessibly in his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, delivered on October 29, 1945, at the Club Maintenant in Paris and published in 1946. The argument is that the atheist existentialist takes seriously the consequence that God does not exist. There is no divine artisan who conceived the human essence before creating human beings. Unlike a paper knife, which has a function that precedes and determines its manufacture, a human being first exists appears in the world without a given nature or purpose, and then defines herself through her choices and projects. There is no human nature that specifies in advance what a good human life consists in. This is the sharpest possible departure from Aristotle's ergon argument. For Aristotle, the entire enterprise of ethics rests on the claim that there is a characteristic function of human beings that can be identified from the structure of the human soul. Sartre denies that there is such a soul structure to be identified. Consciousness is sheer negativity, the power of not being what one is and projecting toward what one is not. There is no telos inscribed in this. Structure, because the structure is precisely the absence of a fixed, given nature. Simone de Beauvoir, 1908 to 1986 Common Era, in The Ethics of Ambiguity, Pour un moral de l'ambiguïté, published in 1947, took the existentialist framework and gave it an explicitly social and political dimension that is less fully developed in Sartre's Being and Nothingness. De Beauvoir argues that authentic existence is not solipsistic, that one's own freedom is genuinely achieved only in a world in which the freedom of others is also possible. The serious person who denies freedom by identifying completely with a role, an ideology, or a social function. What de Beauvoir calls the esprit de sérieux, the spirit of seriousness, is in bad faith in a way that has social and political consequences. Oppressive social arrangements, on de Beauvoir's analysis, produce conditions in which bad faith is structurally encouraged. When the social world treats certain classes of people as things rather than as free subjects, those people are denied the material and social conditions for authentic existence. This argument anticipates the direction Sartre's own thinking would take in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, 1960, where he attempted to integrate existentialist ontology with a Marxist analysis of historical materialism, seeking to explain how bad faith is reproduced not only as an individual psychological project, but as a structural feature of social and economic relations. The question that connects Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, Marcus Aurelius's meditations, and Sartre's Being and Nothingness is not a question about happiness in any colloquial sense. It is a question about what it means for a human being to be fully realized, to live in a way that actualizes whatever is most distinctively human about human existence. That the three answer differently is significant, but less significant than that they agree the question is tractable, serious, and unavoidable for any person who thinks carefully about their own existence. Aristotle's answer locates the conditions of eudaimonia in nature, in the teleological structure of the human soul, in the virtues that actualize it, in the social relationships, particularly character friendship, that sustain it, and in the external goods that enable it. The Stoics retain the teleological framework. Living according to nature is the Stoic formulation of the highest good, but strip it of dependence on external goods. Eudaimonia is available to the slave and the emperor alike, because virtue is internal to the rational faculty, and the rational faculty cannot be enslaved by any external power. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is the record of what this project looks like in daily practice, conducted under conditions, military command, political administration, plague, personal loss, that the theoretical stoicism of Zeno or Chrysippus could not fully have anticipated. Sartre denies the teleological framework altogether. There is no soul structure specifying a telos, no characteristic function of the human being to be actualized. But in place of eudaimonia, he puts authenticity, living in full acknowledgement of one's freedom and one's facticity simultaneously, taking radical responsibility for one's choices, and refusing the comfort of bad faith. The revival of Aristotelian virtue ethics in the second half of the 20th century was inaugurated most visibly by Alastair MacIntyre's After Virtue, published in 1981. MacIntyre's diagnosis is that contemporary moral philosophy, by which he means primarily Kantian deontology and Millian utilitarianism, has inherited the vocabulary of a moral framework without the framework itself. The result is moral discourse that is interminable. Both sides in any moral argument adduce premises that are valid within their respective tacit background theories. But the background theories are incommensurable, and there is no agreed procedure for adjudicating between them. MacIntyre's argument is that the Aristotelian tradition, centered on virtue, narrative, and telos, provides the only available alternative that makes moral disagreement tractable, by providing a standard, however contestable, in terms of which moral claims could be evaluated. What would a fully virtuous person, acting from a complete character within an ongoing social practice, do in this situation? Martha Nussbaum's contributions to this revival are at least as significant and different in emphasis. In The Fragility of Goodness, 1986, Nussbaum argues against both the Stoic move of eliminating dependence on external goods and the Platonic move of locating value in a transcendent form, on the grounds that both involve a falsification of human experience as it is actually lived. The tragic vision of Greek literature. Nussbaum analyzes Aeschylus's Agamemnon of 458 before Common Era, Sophocles' Antigone of approximately 441 before Common Era, and Euripides' Hecuba, expresses an insight that Aristotle shared and the Stoics denied, that eudaimonia is genuinely vulnerable, that one can live excellently and be destroyed by contingency, and that this vulnerability is constitutive of what it means to be a human being embedded in a shared world. The Stoic response to this vulnerability, redefining eudaimonia so that it cannot be touched by any external contingency, is, on Nussbaum's reading, a philosophical flight from the human condition rather than a resolution of it. The Stoic sage who achieves complete autarkia has paid a price, the severance of genuine emotional investment in the welfare of particular others, which is constitutive of the most valuable forms of human relationship. This returns directly to the Aristotelian point about character friendship, that a fully flourishing life requires caring about particular people in particular ways, and that this caring makes one genuinely vulnerable to their loss. Nussbaum's later work, developed in sustained dialogue with the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen, who received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1998, produced the capabilities approach presented in Nussbaum's Women and Human Development, 2000, and Sen's Development as Freedom, 1999. The capabilities approach identifies a set of central human capabilities, including the ability to live a life of normal length, to have adequate health, to use the senses and imagination, to experience emotions, to exercise practical reason, to affiliate with others on terms of mutual respect, to live with concern for other species, to play. and to exercise effective control over one's political and material environment as the minimum conditions for a life meeting the threshold of human dignity. This is a neo-Aristotelian framework in that it grounds normative claims about justice and political development in an account of human flourishing. But it deliberately avoids the metaphysical commitments of the Aristotelian ergon argument, which Nussbaum and Son regard as unsuitable for a pluralist international political philosophy. Julia Onnes's The Morality of Happiness, 1993, approached the Eudaimonist tradition from a different angle. Rather than reviving or applying Aristotelian ethics to contemporary moral questions, she examined the full range of Hellenistic ethical theories: Stoic, Epicurean, Pyrrhonist, skeptic, academic, as serious philosophical positions in systematic dialogue with each other. Onnes's central thesis is that all Hellenistic ethical theories share a common structure. They are Eudaimonist, in that they begin from the question of what Eudaimonia consists in and take practical philosophy to consist in specifying that content and developing practices that lead toward it. This common structure makes the debates between them, whether virtue is sufficient for Eudaimonia, what role pleasure plays in the good life, whether the sage is the standard of moral achievement or an impossible ideal, genuinely rational debates that can be evaluated rather than merely rhetorical contests between incompatible value systems. The philosopher Charles Taylor, born in 1931, in The Ethics of Authenticity, 1991, argues that the concept of authenticity in post-romantic and existentialist thought represents a legitimate moral ideal, one properly understood not as mere subjectivism, but as the ideal of being true to an original, individual way of being that is genuinely one's own. Taylor traces this genealogy from the moral sense theorist Francis Hutcheson, 1694 to 1746 Common Era, through Rousseau's idea of the inner voice of conscience, through the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder's 1744 to 1803 Common Era notion of individual originality, to the existentialist insistence on radical responsibility. On Taylor's reading, Sartrean authenticity is not a break with the Eudaimonist tradition, but its modern individualist articulation, stripped of the metaphysical backing that Aristotle provided through the ergon argument. Bernard Williams, 1929 to 2003 Common Era, in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, 1985, offered the most searching critique of the Aristotelian revival. Williams was deeply sympathetic to Aristotle's general approach, a persistent critic of both Kantian deontology and utilitarian moral theory, and his concept of moral luck, developed in a 1976 essay of that title, was in part an argument that Aristotle was right to think that eudaimonia is subject to contingency in ways that pure Kantian moral worth is not. But Williams was skeptical that the specific content of Aristotelian virtue could survive the historical distance between 4th century Athens, a slave society in which citizenship was restricted to free adult males, and contemporary moral life. His concept of ground projects, the commitments that give a particular person's life its character and make it worth living from the inside, is a deliberately deteleologized analog to eudaimonia, one that does not require a metaphysical claim about human nature to cash out, but that takes seriously the Aristotelian insight that a life well lived is constituted by substantial, sustained commitments rather than by momentary satisfactions. The thread through 2,300 years is not a progressive refinement of a single answer. It is the repeated return to a single question under radically different conditions. Aristotle asked what living well required, given the teleological structure of nature and the social organization of the Athenian polis in the mid-4th century BCE. The Stoics asked the same question after the polis had been superseded by empire. First, the Macedonian Empire of Alexander reigned 336 to 323 before Common Era, and then the Roman, and found the answer in the citadel of the rational will, which no emperor or general could storm. Marcus Aurelius asked it from inside the largest empire the ancient Western world had known, in a tent on the Danube, aging and ill, governing an empire afflicted by plague, conducting wars he had not sought, and wrote his answer in Greek, in private, for no audience, making no claim that he had fully achieved what he described. Sartre asked the question in Paris in 1943, under German occupation, having been a prisoner of war, in a historical moment in which the mechanisms of political coercion, racial ideology, and mass complicity had been rendered visible with extraordinary clarity. His answer, that the fundamental human condition is radical freedom, that bad faith is the refusal of this condition, and that authentic existence is the project of living in full acknowledgement of it, was shaped by that specific historical situation. It was also shaped by the 2,300 years of philosophical reflection that preceded it, whose vocabulary Sartre both appropriated and contested. What changes between Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, and Sartre is the metaphysical ground of the answer, from the teleological structure of nature to the universal logos of Stoic reason to the radical negativity of Sartrean consciousness. What does not change is the question itself. Given that one is a conscious, mortal being embedded in a social and historical world one did not choose and cannot fully control, what would it mean to have lived well? Aristotle called the capacity from which this question arises reason, and said its full exercise in a complete life, with friends and sufficient goods, in a just polis, constitutes Eudaimonia. Marcus called it the hegemonican, the ruling faculty, and said its unimpeded exercise in accordance with reason, whatever the external world provides or withholds, is what is worth pursuing. Sartre called it the pour soi, the for itself, and said that the attempt to escape its demands through identification with a role, an ideology, or a fixed social function is the fundamental form of human inauthenticity. The names differ. The fact of consciousness that provokes the question is the same. That was Eudaimonia, Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, Marcus Aurelius's meditations, and Sartre's being and nothingness. From offline, connected overnight. Sleep well or carry on.